right, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to the wellness series from Kids in Crisis, Helping Kids Thrive. And I thank you for joining us this morning. I want to give everyone the information that we are recording today's webinar so it can be viewed in the future on the Kids in Crisis website. I want to welcome everyone and introduce our guest, Dr. Harry Adamakos, who is the consulting psychologist for Kids in Crisis, and a loved person who is lovingly called Dr. Harry. And Dr. Adamakos is our clinical and forensic psychologist who's been in practice for over 30 years, specializing in family matters related to divorce, separation, and custody issues and blended families. So welcome, Harry. And I didn't introduce myself. My name is Denise Quayle, and I'm the managing director at Kids in Crisis. And we're going to have a conversation about helping children and families through a divorce. I want to let people know that they can go on to the Q&A section and plug in any questions you may have. And I'll try to get to audience questions throughout the discussion. And that those questions are confidential, only to be seen by myself. And we'll get started. So Harry, thank you for joining us. And, I think a lot of families wonder if there is ever a bad time or a better time to get divorced when they have children. What do you think about that?
First, thank you for having me today, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about a topic that affects many families, and that's been true for many years. There's never really a good time, and there certainly isn't a perfect time to tell children about divorce. It is a significant event that is, by most anybody's estimate, difficult and sometimes very painful. Now, over time, it may become less painful, but usually initially it is difficult. So there's no perfect and hard to find a good time. But the general rule of thumb would be to tell children relatively soon after it is decided that a divorce is going to happen. It is very difficult for parents to hold on to that secret that there's going to be a divorce. It's a family secret of magnitude, and it's very difficult for parents to hold that secret. It will leak out with different tensions and perhaps then get blurted out in a way that would not be ideal, because there are correct ways to tell children about divorce, and those are more important to make it a better process than finding the right time. That said, the only caveat I would put out is that it would be good to try to avoid overlap with significant transitions that the child might be involved in. So, for example, I don't think I would be talking to my children about divorce at the time they were graduating high school. If they're in the prom season and the graduation season, you might let that go. It's probably not a Hanukkah or Christmas announcement. It's not something you should probably do around then. So I would try to maybe massage the answer of as soon as you know, to when there is a reasonable window in the lives of the family around the children. So we don't want to color what might be a significant event to a child with the announcement of a divorce. It will be to get your year. My parents told me about divorce on my 18th birthday. That's not how we want children to remember this experience.
Absolutely. So do you think age of a child plays a factor in it, whether elementary, middle, or high school? And should parents do it together?
Well, in terms of timing, I don't think the answer is much different for children of different ages. I think the in terms of timing, what I already answered, I think is the advice to give regardless of age. Younger children benefit from a simpler answer, a simpler message, and it would be good for them to hear from both parents together. I'm sorry, I skipped over one of your questions. It is better to do it together. Generally speaking, there's two types of divorces, with obviously a continuum between low conflict, fairly amicable, fairly civil divorces, and then those that might be considered high conflict or toxic divorces. I'm going to focus more on the former, thinking about aspirationally what do we try to do. Ideally, the parents sit down together to speak to the children. It's one of the reasons why you want to do it sooner than later, because chances are one parent will jump the gun if they're feeling tense, or if the children pose the question to them, your mom, are you and dad going to get divorced? Sometimes kids feel it coming. So you don't want one parent to be in the spot to answer that question. So doing it together is helpful. And if there are certain things that are known, to be able to answer those questions for the children. But for very young children, the question might be answered by mom and dad have decided that we're not living together. We're not getting along as well as we'd like. And that would be the initial start of a maybe scripted kind of conversation that the parents have. What can they both get on board with to tell the children? We typically don't want to get into details. Very young children don't usually ask, don't need it. Older children sometimes ask, but they still don't need it. They don't need the details about what's going on between mom and dad. It's certainly appropriate to tell children, for example, why are you getting divorced? Um, some of that's intimate details between the parents. There's no way to start that conversation and know when to stop it. You're opening a can of worms. It's sufficient to say that's between your dad and I. That's between your mom and I. That we have marriage things that you don't need to know the details about. But we're not getting along, and we think it's going to be better for us to live apart and take care of you both together. We love you. We will both take care of you. And very importantly, it's important for children to hear that they're not to blame. Sometimes children, absent an answer, think that they must somehow be responsible, and the parents are keeping that from them. It's important to say over and over again through a process of discussion that this is between mom and dad. It's an adult problem, not the children's problem. Not the children's fault, I should say. It is their problem. They have a problem.
Mhm. But it's not, they did not cause this.
They did not
Mhm.
cause this. They're not responsible for it. They're not responsible for making mom and dad feel better. They're not responsible. They are clearly the ones who need to get taken care of by the parents who are going through it. Perhaps a difficult time. Probably a difficult time.
Yeah. So then when moving on, once families have acknowledged this is happening, kids are aware that the divorce is happening, what things should parents consider when making custody arrangements? And how involved should the kids be in that? And does age play a factor there? Is there a healthier structure of custody arrangements than not healthy?
There are many different arrangements that can make sense. Um, the major tenet, the major aspirational goal is to try to create a structure that's in the best interest of the children. Now, of course, when there's a divorce, there's a lot of things husbands and wives disagree about, and they may also disagree about what's in the children's best interest. It would be important if parents can try to keep their ego in check and really try to hear the other person's perspective, to develop a realistic plan that will serve the children well, that will serve the family well. We can talk about some of those details in a second. But many people go into the idea of divorce with a traditional idea that children live in one household and they visit the other parent whenever they can, and they come up with a plan. A traditional plan, might have been something like living with mom and then visiting dad on the alternate weekends and maybe dinner during the week. And that's perfectly appropriate for some families. But a more contemporary view of divorce is that if and it's changed with the role of mothers and fathers changing to some degree in our society, where there's more of a shared custody. Uh, if that was not the family's history prior at all, then maybe you're not going to go to a shared custody. But if it was the situation before, where both parents were responsible for major meaningful aspects of their children's lives, then you want a custody structure that can mimic that and can foster that. So that's one of the ideas in response to your question. Age age can matter. Very young children, for example, need to have frequent contact with both parents. It's important for their attachment and bonding. when you have more frequent contact, that means the frequency of disruption is higher, but still young children benefit from that, so that they have an experience with each parent on a fairly regular basis. In some cases, that involves children going back and forth between two houses, but with frequently. But in better divorces where people are working together, it can be done by having the children sleep primarily in one house, but have daily contact with the other parent. So we're going to go back probably for this whole hour of our discussion to highlight the idea that even in divorce, if parents can co-parent together, the options of what can be done are much larger, allowing for both consistency and flexibility. They're not inconsistent. They're not impossible to have both. To be have a consistent pattern that children would benefit from, but also have the flexibility that says, in real life, moms and dads have to cover for each other, have to make arrangements.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
as we get to a little bit older children, uh, they can usually tolerate some separation from their parents, let's say elementary school age. So to be away from one parent to the other for a couple of days, um, most children can tolerate that. By the time they get to middle school and high school, a lot of, especially in high school, they have their own lives that are focused around their school, their friends, and their extracurricular activity. The proper structure there is what can help them maintain that.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they are given more voice, teenagers are given more voice to help develop what will work for them. But at the same time, highlight the importance of being having a meaningful time with both parents is still the goal. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes high school students go 1 week on and 1 week off. Sometimes they stay in one family, one house, but they see the other parent often. Sometimes, especially when there's some distance between the households and friend groups might be separate, both parents can't support it. Uh, Holidays and summer vacations are spent with one parent, whereas the school year is spent with the other parent. It's
Mm-hmm.
complex. It's very complex, but there is the idea that there can be changes because children change and life circumstances will change. Even though divorce will feel like the biggest change in your life, there are other more subtle changes that happen all the time. And it would be great for parents to be able to be responsive to their children and develop a plan that allows for that flexibility.
Yeah, so that flexibility as they get older and hearing more from older kids about what their needs are seems to be part of it.
From the moment, well, even prior, but from the moment that the divorce is announced, staying within the topic here, that's the beginning of the process. It's not as if you can have one perfect conversation and we're
Right.
done. That's it. It's a process. So that conversation that you had in the beginning, one where you are saying that you both love the children, that they can, I didn't say this before, but you're inviting them to talk to either parent. And this is the power of doing it together. The children get to hear that mom and dad heard the same thing. They said it
Mm-hmm.
together and they didn't disagree in front of them. So things like, we love you, you're not responsible, please talk to me or your mom, or please talk to me and your dad if you have any questions. We're going to work really hard to take care of you together. Those are important ideas that need to be said in the beginning, but then throughout the time that follows, you have to kind of come through on that, right? So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it's a process, and as parents, you want to pay attention as best you can to the verbal and nonverbal cues that your children are giving you about whether they are struggling or not. A lot of kids do okay through divorce. Many kids do well through divorce. Not all do, but many do. And usually when they do well, it's because the parents are going to follow some of these things that we're talking about today. That's an important ingredient. They are maintained in their school and their extracurricular activities and their friends. These are all buffering, insulating factors that help children find natural coping mechanisms to get through what might be some grief, probably will be some grief, some anxiety, but within the bounds of being manageable.
Mm-hmm.
So the process gets started off by the conversation, and then to kind of go where we were a second ago, Denise, it's coming through on that promise in the way that is guided by their best interests.
Mm-hmm.
really hard to do in divorce. I don't want to be so present this so naively as this is easy, folks. This is what you can do. It's really difficult because the parents have their own emotions through this. We're asking,
Absolutely.
we're asking
Right.
parents to be the best possible parents they can be at probably one of the worst times of their lives. That dichotomy is the challenge of all of this.
Hmm.
Um, so, and I'm sure we'll talk about some other ideas later,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
this falls on the parents.
Absolutely. And reinforcing it throughout the process. I like the idea that it is a process. It's not a one and done conversation. It's all the way through. But when you think about kids that are doing okay through a divorce and kids that aren't, what do you see? What are some of the psychological effects that divorce can have on children?
Well, first, I just want to reiterate that many children do well, and if they can get through a divorce, whether it's with the help of interventions or whether it's on their own or whether it's just with the support of their parents and their extended family, by the way, who, uh, if we haven't given the parents enough work to do, let me give this, you are responsible for your people. So sometimes there's an aunt or a grandma or a grandfather who's a little bit of a loose cannon. You
Mhm.
need to sit down with them and educate them about what you want for your children because blood is thicker than water, and typically family will circle around their person, but sometimes they do that inappropriately. And if you're working really hard as the mom and dad to try to keep the children in a nurtured way, uh, you don't want it to be undermined inadvertently by loving extended family, but who sometimes either they don't want to or they don't know how to. It's important you try to keep that in bounds. But to go back to the question, children can learn how to be resilient. A lot of children of what I'll call successful divorces, even though painful, come out more resilient, more independent, and learn to tolerate differences in others. If they can see that their parents can tolerate each other even though they don't get along, that's a really important modeled lesson. Children will know that you're not happy. You've told them we're getting divorced because we're not happy with each other or we're not getting along, but yet you're going to get along for them. That's a fantastically powerful model
Mhm.
to try to. It's the goal. But sometimes that's hard to do, and sometimes even when parents do it very correctly, by the way, meaning they're doing all these things we're talking about. Sometimes children are affected, and you'll see that sadness lingers, and it becomes something more like depression. Worry intensifies, and it starts to look more like anxiety. You're trying. Their frustration gets turned into anger very quickly. These would be things you'd watch for behavioral signs, emotional signs like that. Withdrawing into their own worlds, into their own rooms, maybe disconnecting from friends. These are all any changes like that linger. Um,
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
in week one, all this might happen. Week two, all this might happen. But if it gets to be longer, and because you know that the start of this was the announcement of the divorce, excuse me, um, because you know that was the start of it, the announcement of the divorce, uh, it's probably better to try to get some assistance for children, uh, because these are signs of depression or anxiety. Even
Mhm.
anger in children is a sign usually of depression in
Mhm.
children. If they're a little bit older, their teenage years, if you start to see either new drug use or escalated drug use, a lot of high school students, for example, use marijuana,
Mhm.
despite what parents may want for their children. They do. A lot of parents know that about their children, but still, if they're starting drug use or alcohol use or abuse, intensifies because you kind of had a thought that they were using before. These are inappropriate coping mechanisms that are understandable because they're trying to help themselves feel better, but the way they're going about it is not constructive. So these would be all signs that for children who are struggling with the process.
Mhm.
An-
Would
Another,
parents' behavior have an impact on that?
well, being aware and on it, so to speak, being in tune with your children as part of this process, the process that you had before you announced divorce, ideally, but you're being in tune with your children, you're aware, you're paying enough attention to notice uh, is important, and then being direct with them about it. That this isn't a secret or something to be ashamed of. I can see you're struggling. It looks to me like you're really sad. To if they don't come to you, if a child can't come to you, you can still go to them
Yeah.
to express your concern or worry or checking in. Even for children who are doing well, it's a you don't need to do it every day, but every once in a while. How you doing with the divorce, John?
Hmm.
Mary, how you feeling these days?
Yeah.
You got to check in a little more actively, and children,
Hmm.
when given the opportunity, will sometimes just answer.
Hmm.
More typically, especially as they get older, will say, "I'm fine, mom. Leave me alone." They
Yeah.
might push back a bit, but then they know. But you've reasserted that they can talk to you, and a lot of times those same children will come to you later. A lot of times, no matter what the age is, the the time right before bedtime is a soft time, and
Hmm.
children feel a little more vulnerable, and they're more likely to talk to you. Quite frankly, being present, even with your 16-year-old, being a little more present around bedtime is a lot gets said during that last hour or so before they go to bed.
Absolutely. And do you think it's a time where co-parenting is critical in terms of parents being on the same page of the impact it's having if there are signs of depression, anxiety? Like, what are the divorced parents doing with that?
Um, Another version of what we've been talking about, uh, it would be very good for parents to share what they see about their
With each
children.
other?
Because even before divorce, parents see their children differently, and there's value in the other person's perspective. But it's also true that children behave differently with both parents, but the information sharing lets you see the children better. That's important whether they're sharing the custody, if they're living separately, because sometimes, well, we didn't touch base on this, but sometimes people separate before the divorce happens. That's pretty common. And in
Hmm.
fact, I would say if it's possible, it's advisable that separation happen before the divorce because it's very tense. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes it's very tense. Once a divorce has started the process, by the time it's finalized, which can be a little bit long in Connecticut, a lot of bad things can happen. It's a really tense time. So, it depends on the resources and the thinking parents have. But if you can separate to handle the divorce separated, um, that would be often something I would recommend if it's possible. It's
Yeah,
not
a
always
lot of
possible.
families, it's not always possible. A lot of families are finding even during COVID or finances may require them to stay in the same house probably longer than either parent would want. But
Right, and that's true. It's about the options, about the finances. The uncertainty makes things freeze a little bit. We tend to freeze
mhm,
our what we can do. But what I was starting to say is that even if both parents are sharing the custody, still they see their children differently, and their children show a different part of themselves to each parent. So sharing the information would be important. Um, I guess the caveat and the advice on that is don't use that as an opportunity to argue. Take it just as information. So, if one of your children is struggling and the one parent says to the other, she's our daughter Susie's been very cheerful lately. I've noticed that she's not happy. That's not the open door for the other parent to say, well, if you didn't put us through this, she wouldn't be sad. It's not an opportunity to launch into the tension between the parents because that will just shut that communication down. It's really important you try to just hear it. It's an observation, and you work with it as a parent. It's just the way it is. So
mhm,
information sharing is part of it, and being on the same page in terms of how to respond is important.
mhm.
To do this, a lot of parents engage with a professional at the time that they've decided to be divorced. A lot of people have been in marriage therapy, but co-parent counseling is different than marriage therapy. It's a different animal altogether. It should be a different animal altogether. In marriage therapy, that's about trying to communicate and understand better in order to maintain the marriage.
Mhm.
Some of those skills are really important, even if you get divorced, but it's different. In a divorce co parenting, it's about how to operate to take care of the children. It's much more present, focused, it's more problem solving oriented.
Mhm.
But engaging the help of a professional to help with how do you talk to all the things we're talking about today, how to talk to the children about
Yeah.
it, how to respond, how to stay on the same page, even though obviously there's a tension and disagreement that's leading to a divorce. That person can also be helpful to answering the question, is it time for our children, for any of our children, to maybe go into counseling?
Yeah, so that would be a question. Should parents have their children see a therapist because they're getting divorced?
I would say not automatically. I would say not automatically. I think the idea about the parent counselor is more important as a thing to do preemptively,
Hmm.
um, because many children do manage the divorce. They manage it well if if they're good at expressing themselves, if they have a sense of freedom and safety to express themselves at home, and that they talk to the parents. A lot of times that's sufficient. They're engaged in their activities. They've stayed involved in their extracurriculars. They have their friends. Um, School is going well. That's an important ingredient. A lot of times kids will kind of muscle through that, and for the better. I mean, it's not just muscling through it and barely survive. They learn skills in the process of doing it on their own, but they need the supports that we're talking about. But then there's a percentage of children, and I can't give you the number. There's some
Hmm.
that really benefit from therapy. But to answer your question, I personally and professionally do not recommend that children automatically go into psychotherapy when their family's getting divorced.
Hmm. But if there's those psychological effects, that depression and anxiety, as you say, over time, if it seems to be going on, those are the kids that you think might benefit from seeing someone.
Yes, I think for sure you don't want to wait longer. So it's a balancing act on that. But I guess I should say one thing: if the child has pre-existing kinds of concerns in the area of depression or anxiety or conduct issues, um, and they were not in therapy, then perhaps going through a divorce could be the tilting factor that says, you know what, maybe we should have our child in therapy because there already is a pre-existing situation, and this is a stress that likely would exacerbate the pre-existing condition. Depressed children usually are more depressed when their family's getting divorced. Anxious kids are more anxious, and kids who have conduct problems tend to have more conduct problems.
Hmm. Yeah, this just brings it to a head.
Yes.
Um, do you think, have any thoughts about whether gender plays a role or a factor when considering visitation or custody arrangements or anything? Should girls be with their mom? Should boys be with their dad? Does it get mixed up?
Um, Generally speaking, I would say no. I don't think there's a automatic yes answer to that because of what we do know from research and from our experience as clinical psychologists and mental health practitioners is that children benefit in different ways from both their parents. And it's not that one way is more important than the other. Now, there may be life transitions where somebody needs a little bit more mommy time or a little more dad time. But overall, both parents and all children benefit from the parents being able to learn how to provide that support. But let's just say we're having uh, an emerging pubescent girl. Probably she's going to be a little more comfortable with her mom around those issues. It doesn't have to be off topic or off, we can't deal with it at dad's house. In fact, it would be really good if mom helps the daughter in that situation know that she can talk to dad. And mom will be more better able to do that if she knows that dad will send it back to her if that's what the girl wants. Again, if the couple can show each other that they trust that the child's best interest is at hand, you don't need to create a different custody arrangement. You just need to handle the situation in the way, quite frankly, as you might have handled it if you were living together.
Hmm.
I mean, a lot of families, I think it's safe to say, if there's a mother or father in the house, moms are going to help girls move into their pubescent
Hmm.
experience, body changes, etc. Um,
How do you think that plays out when the divorced couple ends up with new partners? There's a stepmom or or a boyfriend or a girlfriend living in the house. How should parents manage if that other sex person is having input on their child? So a mom's has an opinion about dad's new wife or girlfriend, or vice versa.
Well, new partners can certainly complicate issues, and the sooner those new partners are involved with the divorce, the more difficult it can be. Um, that said, though, whenever there might be step parents, it's very, very important that the first person be the biological parent to deal with things, and the step parent is backup. So let's just use the example I'm talking about. And there's a stepmother in that situation. If the girl's comfortable going to the stepmother, for help with something, how to use something, how to buy something, whatever, how do I, and they're there, then the step parent has, if they're a trusted adult, they should step in, but they should still try to defer it to the biological mom. We should talk to your mom about this, Mary. Mary, this is important. This is a big deal. Your mom would like to know about this, and try to defer it back. And if the relationship between the mother and the stepmother isn't good enough, then the father needs to do that. So we're going to highlight in this kind of example the importance of communication, being on the same page, and sharing information. Ultimately, sometimes children want secrets to be kept by one parent or the other, but they should probably know that if it's something important going on, there's no secrets. The adults talk to each other. That's what we're trying to establish.
Mhm.
Um, Again, these are sometimes aspirational. We don't always get there, but that's still the place to shoot for. So I hope that answered that question. But by and large, it's not about changing the structure of the custody. It's about, if needed, change the nature of the relationship between the parents, if
Mm.
possible. I guess in some ways, some of this advice could be preaching to the choir. The people who are already doing that, communicating and doing this well, are able to do it. Those who are having a hard time doing it, this can be very difficult, this process.
Absolutely. Communication when maybe there are battles over finances, child support, arrangements, custody, extended family, or new partners. Communication is key. But what are some of the tips when you're having those hard conversations, when you may be battling with your spouse about money one minute, and now you're concerned about maybe your child needs therapy the next minute and you need them on board with it? It's a juggling act, isn't it?
It's a juggling act, and it's important to try to separate the issues. To try to not let one bleed into the other. You come up with an interesting example, Denise. Finances and therapy. A lot of times, therapy requires a dedication of finances. Sometimes, especially when financially families might be struggling a little bit, the idea, do we really need to spend the money on therapy, is a could be a genuine place of disagreement. Because even the answer I gave you before is, it's not an automatic yes, they should be in therapy, right? So if you go with that premise, one parent might say, I think we should hold off because, well, it'd be nice to say it for what it is. If it's because of finances, say so. If it's because you think your child doesn't need it, then say that. But so there's still a separation,
Mhm.
but trying to be straightforward with it. The other part that actually is one example you didn't give, Denise, which is a place where tension often occurs, is around discipline. What to
Right.
do with children when they behave a certain way. A lot of times there was a difference of opinion during a marriage. Divorce didn't need to happen, except it accentuates that difference of opinion. It's really hard for children, very disparate parents, in terms of how they approach discipline and expectations, and such like that. Um,
And does a blended family play into that with discipline? When different parents are disciplining not their biological children and other children, and how does blended families fit into discipline?
well, it's more complicated. The more moving pieces you have, the more complicated it is. Even with the discussion we're having at this point, when you ask ages or gender, most children of more age, and many families have children of different genders. So it's complicated as you add other pieces. You ask the question about step parents. Well, that complicates it a little further. You add step siblings or half siblings into the equation, and it's more complicated. Um, I don't mean to sidestep your question. I think I am, though, a little bit, because it just gets to a point that it's very complicated. But if people can strive towards something that they all can buy into, meaning mom and dad, and it starts there, right? If mom and dad can recognize that the other parent is probably not all wrong, and you as a parent are not all right, that's a good place to start. Maybe
Mhm.
you can find some middle ground so that the more strict parent can actually maybe loosen up a little bit, and the more lenient parent can maybe become a little more firm and strict in their approach.
Mhm.
A lot of times, what parents do, whether married or divorced, is they try to compensate for the other parent. So if I saw you, Denise, as being too strict, I might try to overcompensate by being more lenient. All that does is create a bigger polarization, right?
Right.
Because as the child is confused in that and maybe plays one parent off the other, one parent, you in this case, are going to get more and more strict, and the other parent is going to compensate by becoming more lenient.
Mhm.
Parents are best served and children are best served by learning to find a balance. So it's important that even in divorce, where parents oftentimes feel very guilty and feel bad for their children, it's really important that the expectations for the children stay pretty close to what they were. So discipline doesn't get thrown out the window.
Mhm.
Routines certainly don't get thrown out the window. We try to keep the routines. Um, and and a more lenient parent will find their parenting easier if they can learn to be a little more strict, a little more firm, and a very strict parent would have better emotional access to their children if they could learn to be a little more lenient and
Mhm.
focus more on hearing their children instead of disciplining their children.
Yeah. And these are divorces that we're talking more about that didn't have an element or a layer of domestic violence where there's a safety concern with parents. I mean, those are things, what would you say? The court would have to be more involved in making those arrangements. Some parents, because of their history, maybe there was spousal abuse or something that might make these discussions even harder.
Yes, absolutely. You're raising a really important point. Because I've chosen to focus on the relatively more on the more amicable
Right.
divorces, um, the other side oftentimes is complicated by domestic violence, abuse, control, um, and other types of behaviors that make parents not able to be with each other, and that needs to be respected. Because if a parent doesn't feel safe, they can't do what I'm talking about. They just can't.
Right.
It's not fair to ask them to do that beyond what they're capable of. That said, there are times that parents have a very difficult marital relationship, but that did not. Um, it's not the way the parent was with the child, and this can be very, very complicated. Almost always becomes part of a complicated, um, high conflict divorce because um, while people who are abusive can be abusive to everybody, there are some people who are abusive inside their marriage because of that's how they found their um, that's how they express very inappropriately, very dangerously their discontent, their unhappiness. Just like kids can sometimes show depression by anger and acting out. Unfortunately, adults can too, but we have a higher standard for adults, and we don't tolerate, we shouldn't tolerate mistreatment of a spouse. Um, and if there was a history of mistreatment, abuse, um, sometimes the parents can figure out a mechanism to help keep both parents feeling safe, but still let the children have a meaningful relationship with both parents. Sometimes that's not the case. A lot of times the court would say, well, this needs to be a very protected experience for the children, and they will have the children be with one parent over the other.
Mhm. Where they'll have one parent be a custodial parent and the other, and the child never goes and lives with the other parent, you're saying?
Well, they might go live with the other parent, but the parents are kept apart. Um, there's a lot of renditions of this, a lot of variations. But if a person, um, stereotypically, if a wife feels unsafe in the presence of her husband, there are
Mhm.
still ways to have custody arrangements where the wife doesn't have to be in the presence of the husband.
Right, right.
Those are complicated. Those move away from many of the things we're talking about today because children see that. It's a very different experience if mom and dad are never in the room together. They're never at graduation together. They're never at my soccer game together.
Yeah.
Kids understand that that's because of reasons.
Right. And it's a balance to be that trusted, honest parent without um, talking poorly about the other spouse, without divulging too much of why the marriage failed or why they're separated, like those intimate details you were saying, but yet you want to feel like you're honest with your child and you can be trusted to tell the truth. I mean, there's like a fine line there.
Very fine line that's made very difficult by these sorts of issues. But yes, it's important. Children do not need to know all the experiences. They might need help processing what they know themselves, but they don't need to hear the parents' spin on it
Mhm.
necessarily. So let's just say, in a situation, a child witnessed some level of physicality between two parents, and the child says, "Mommy, are you and Daddy separating because of what he did to you that night? I saw you fight."
Mhm.
Um, it's going to be uncomfortable.
Mhm.
A parent can't lean on the child to say, "Yes, that was horrible, and I couldn't stand living with him anymore." That would be the impulse. That would be my impulse to.
Right.
But children are not our support. I think the better answer is there was a lot of things going on. How did you feel about what happened that night? Or and if the child can't, right, if the child can't say anything, you could say, "I bet you were very scared. It was not a good night." You don't need to add that I was very scared as the mother. You don't need to. Now, if the child says, "Were you scared, Mom?" Ultimately, I think the truth is important.
Mhm.
But I would really kind of go back to the axiom that you don't need to answer questions that children don't ask. If your child can't ask it, they may not need the answer.
Mhm.
They decide, especially as children get a little bit older, they pick and choose their questions, and to some degree that may match what they're able to hear.
Mhm.
So I know we're doing this it's an example we didn't talk about before. I haven't rehearsed it, but it's a common enough example that I think it's a real challenge for, in this case, the parent who was the recipient of abuse to handle it in a way that doesn't go too far, because there's a lot of emotion and it's really painful, and sometimes that is the cause of divorce, and oftentimes it is the cause of divorce. Sometimes people live with that for a very long time because they're fearful of divorce. Maybe it's part of the same abusive cycle. It's a different topic, Denise. Either you gotta get me to come back or get somebody else to come in and talk about it.
No, definitely. No, it's a whole nother aspect of trying to figure out how to do this the best way for kids. And I'm thinking also it may become part of the conversation of where kids want to live. Like if they know they may turn against the other parent, and then how do parents deal with that their child doesn't want to go with the other parent for that weekend or that nightly dinner, that they start putting up a fight.
Well, I wish I could say it's that clear cut. It's not. It doesn't work in a very predictable way. Sometimes a child will identify with the parent who was abusive. I don't. I think you have to be careful about starting the idea of this conversation with what do the children want. What do they need is a different concept than what they want. As they get older, what they want may have a better chance of aligning with what they need, and certainly the courts will recognize an older teenager's wishes, and it will consider it differently than a young child's wishes. But it's really
So
about.
that's where age plays out. So there you're saying whether they're elementary, preschool, elementary, middle school, or high school may have a really important piece.
Yes, their voice has a differential value. It should probably always matter, but the truth is, the distinction between what children need and want is often very complicated. Parents disagree with this, can genuinely disagree with this, and children themselves, you might have good reasons or bad reasons. So for expressing their feeling, but what they need is the question, right? Children's best interest is about what they need. Now, if we can just kind of, let's just use the example we're talking about now, but in the context of that example, and then more amicable situations, more peaceful situations, children still want some basic things from their parents. They want they want both parents to stay involved in their life. Sometimes even in abusive situations, they don't want that other parent to go away. They want them to stop fighting. They want them to stop hurting each other, their parents, but they don't want them to go away most of the time. Because if they go away, it's a form of rejection. Even if as a child, I say to you, I don't want to be with you, Dad. If Dad assents to that, he's rejected the child. It's
Mhm.
acting out,
Mhm.
right? It's an upset. It's a depression. It's something, but children don't want to be rejected. They want both their parents involved in their life, and they want both parents to let that be okay. They want the parents to stop fighting and work really hard to take care of them. They want that to happen. And while it's certainly more complex in a domestic violence situation, it doesn't change what the kids want,
Mhm.
and it doesn't change what they need. It's a
Mhm.
question of whether it's doable. That could be for lawyers and judges and mental health people to decide. But that's what children want, and if possible, it is what they need. If it's
Mhm.
possible to give that to them, it is what they need. Sometimes it's not possible. Um, children want to love both their parents, and they want to enjoy their time with each parent. They don't want to have the experience of feeling like they've got to hide a good time. I just visited mom, I just visited dad, but I can't talk about it because it gets mom or dad, the other parent, upset because I had a good time. They want to enjoy, they want to be free to enjoy both parents. They'd like to probably share what they did freely. Sharing is different than having an inquisition. A lot of times parents cross a line, not only, a lot of times by accident, just
Mhm.
wanting too much detail. Let the
Yeah.
child drive that conversation. How is it? How was your weekend at dad's this weekend? The opening question, let the child answer.
Mhm.
Try not to follow up with too many answers because it starts to feel a little bit like an inquisition to many children.
Right. And they might feel like they're betraying the other parent by saying anything.
Yeah, and they will, and important and related to that, children want the parents to communicate directly. They don't want to be the mediaries. They don't want. I've had conversations with colleagues who will disagree with me on this. I think it's really bad form for one parent to send a child support payment in an envelope with the child. I think that's just a bad idea. I think, and I'm using that as a very gross example, very to just say they also don't want to be the ones to bring messages like we want to tell your mom to send over the ice skates so we have them here. No, you tell mom or you tell dad, communicate directly. Children don't want to be in that job. It creates a lot of slippery slopes about what can be shared. It creates a lot of situations for a parent's frustration or tone to get inserted in that communication.
Mhm.
Children want parents to communicate directly with each other. Um, Children also pref- want their parents to say only nice things about the other parent or nothing at all. Now, that goes to your question before, Denise. It's hard when, in that example we were giving, where somebody may have been, um, in a domestic violence situation.
Mhm.
But it might still be possible to say nothing at all. It
Yeah.
might still be possible. It can be hard, but it might still be possible. But they would prefer, and let's go to more typical divorces that don't have domestic violence as part of it. Say nice things. Compliment the other parent when you can.
Mhm.
You know, someone comes home and says, "Oh, mom made me a birthday cake. Oh, your mom is a really good baker. I bet she was good." It's a little thing like that that says, you know what, there's a little less ice between mom and dad than I
Yep.
thought, right?
Yep.
If they go visit their grandparents, or you think they're going to visit their grandparents, tell them, say hi for me. I really, I miss Uncle Joe or Grandpa, whatever it is. It's okay to say that, to share the positive spots. Divorce doesn't mean we have to be so apart that we can't still be human. If you've had 15 years with your in-laws, you don't suddenly have to speak badly about them. In fact, you should look for ways to speak positively of them, to let the children know that they have a bigger family.
Mhm.
It could be a blended family. Now we have step parents and step grandparents, and that they're fortunate to have all these people in their lives. Even though mom and dad aren't together, they're fortunate to have these people. It's nice when parents can do that.
It
But
sounds like
ultimately,
those little niceties also kind of take the stress out of the room. It kind of like it's almost comforting for those kids, it would seem, to hear something nice instead of something hurtful.
yeah, I think it is comforting, and it's giving very explicit permission to have nice feelings in my house about people from, my former wife or my former in-laws, or my former husband, or my former in-laws, or a step parent, that might be. It's giving permit. It's comforting because it's a nice thought, and it's comforting because it's giving explicit permission that we can talk about nice things that don't happen here at the house, even if it's about your mom or about your dad. Like, we don't have to have this wall of silence where children live and sometimes talk about, they have two psychological realities. That everything about mom is one world and everything about dad is one world.
Mhm.
But children have one world that they want both in. We don't
Right.
want them to have two worlds. It's really hard to navigate that.
Yeah.
It's hard to navigate that for communication, for social experiences, and really oneself. Right? Children have components from both families. So if they have to ignore or reject one side of the family or the other, in a way, they're also rejecting part of who they are. And as a
Mhm.
parent, you shouldn't want that.
Absolutely. And it might be different for siblings. Is it hard when one child gets along swimmingly with one parent or the other, or one doesn't want to go, one does? And it's hard to navigate a little bit more when you have a few kids involved?
It can be, and it's common for children to have changing preferences for their parents. Some of this is related to age and gender. You're asking the questions before, but I would
Mhm.
put it more in the range of preference, not need. So there are times that any of you who've had teenage daughters pretty much don't need their parents. It can be one parent or the other until they get to be about 25, and then you get your daughter back.
Yeah,
But
there you go.
it's common enough. You don't want to take that personally, but you also don't want to stop having a relationship, because how you manage that's important. So with different children with different needs, you still have the obligation to try to parent, both of them. And most of the time, it serves children well to have the same custody arrangements with their siblings. They're an important support piece for each other. Um, they will share in their life a common experience, so it's usually a good idea. It also pragmatically makes sense because parents may need to work differentially hard when they don't have the children and need to cut back on work when they're taking care of the children. So there's some pragmatics involved.
Mhm.
But for children, they need that. The one exception I would go to is when the custody is going pretty well, there is room and there's great value in occasional one-on-one contact. So if you have two children or three children, it can be really special to have a day with mom or a day with dad. And to divide the children as the exception more than the rule, can be really very beneficial. This is what people do in married families, right? You don't have to take all the kids to the ball game. You took one at a time to the ball game. You're
Mhm.
going to do the same thing if you're divorced. You're not
Or
going to
that
all
one
go from
kid
that
has a certain interest.
certain interests, right? Dad, while dad with a young child might let their child paint their nails, they probably aren't going to go for a mani pedi together with their 7-year-old daughter in public. They might, if you can do that, go for it. But what I'm saying is that might be the day that she goes, with mom, let's go get a manicure, when she's 10 years old or whatever. It's your birthday. Let's do it. There's room for that. There's absolutely room for that. But those should be the exceptions more than the rules, probably.
That's helpful. That's helpful. It just sounds like it always has to be fluid as time goes on, as things change, as circumstances change, as the family makeup changes, as spouses remarry, introduce new people to the family. It's this ever changing. It just seems to me the theme is about communication and listening to the other parent.
It is that. It's certainly about that with the children,
Yeah.
because they're still going to be the best educators of the parent, right? Being in tune with your children means you're hearing them and fostering communication and you're understanding them, but with the other parent as well. And thankfully, thankfully, most people, if they don't intensify their or escalate their disagreement during the time of the divorce, usually things get better once the divorce is finalized.
Yeah.
And it gets put a little bit, doesn't go away completely, for probably for anybody, but it does move back in the background a little bit. And as it moves back in the background, parents can reach for some of these aspirational goals. The the you brought up a difficult topic. Domestic violence, for example, in a marriage makes that very hard. A really hostile um, divorce process can undermine the potential for the future. So these ideas that have been mostly focused on the process of divorce and the time around the divorce, I understand, as I've said anything today, that those are not easy, and people are not going to be perfect in doing this. I know that. We expect that. But if you're reaching for that, you have a better chance of keeping in play the possibilities of the future and your children's possibilities. To have access to both parents in a meaningful way, the possibility that their lives are kept on track, um, and the possibility that you as a ex-wife or ex-husband can find happiness in your own life. It's really important that parents take care of themselves
Mhm.
in constructive ways. I know we're getting a little close to the end. We'll maybe have some other questions, but I don't want to neglect to say this. Because it's such a hard time for parents, it's important that they get support. They might need to see a therapist, but even if they don't see a therapist, talk to trusted friends, friends that you can lean on, who also will not tell everybody else in the world, and who
Mhm.
will also find a way to do what I'm asking you to do, which is to, when you deal with the other parent, when they deal with the other parent, to be amicable and civil, and to not pollute the child's relationship with anybody else. Um, it's important that you take care of yourself. Mental health, physical health, eat well, try to sleep well the best you can, exercise. It's important that parents try to keep their strength, their emotional and physical strength as they go through this process. Children benefit from seeing mom and dad are okay. That's one of the important factors in children being okay, that mom and dad are okay. If mom or dad are not okay, it makes it really hard for children to be okay.
Absolutely. Harry, what would you suggest for families that are living far apart, that the parents are living far apart and one parent may only see the children or child once a month or so?
Well, living far apart makes this hard, makes these ideas difficult because by, by being meaningfully involved is also being physically present. Um, but sometimes life creates that kind of situation, and um, maybe it depends a little bit on the age of the child. But I'll just generally answer the question of you try to compensate by making up, you're making time, whether it's frequent FaceTime calls, whether it's um, sending more photos back and forth, and then maximizing the time they can be together. So if one parent is out of town, but they do occasionally come in town, assuming the child benefits from it and wants it, you you maybe have flexibility and allow for a 4-day weekend or something that might be able to happen. Or if they're involved in school, maybe not a 4-day weekend solid, but they'll have dinner. They'll see the parent on the weekend, and Friday, Monday, let's just say, just obviously make the some more than the symbolic, the real attempt to take advantage of the opportunity when they can be together.
Mhm.
Similarly, you might look at holidays and vacations differently. A lot of families would split holidays evenly, but if the parents are really far apart, especially if the child is older, it's not unusual for them to spend long periods of time in the summer, um, spend 2 or 3 weeks in a row, not vacationing, just living with the other parent.
Right.
Um,
So parents need to be a little bit flexible, maybe with their custodial arrangement to compensate for the fact that the father or mother doesn't get to see the child during the school year, maybe as much, but maybe take advantage of a holiday or summer so that they
yeah,
can get some longer time.
and depending on the family's means, a younger child is probably okay to go to the other parent, but a high school student,
Yeah.
as much as they may love that parent who's away, is put in a dilemma if they are away so long that they don't have contact with their friends. Now, as a general rule of thumb, um, I guess I'd say, what would the experience of that child be when they go to that other parent? Do they have friends there? Do they have cousins? Do they have relatives? In which case, there is a social experience, which would be maybe a little bit more like what happens when kids go away to camp for 3 weeks or 5 weeks or 7 weeks. I mean, kids
Mhm.
go away for long periods of time, and they do that without, a lot of them enjoy that, but they're usually not in a social void or a social island where they're isolated. So if there's a lot of other stuff going on that's enjoyable and nurturing and beneficial to them, a lot of times they can go for long periods of time. If that's not the case, then I would encourage the parent who lives far away to try to spend the time here, whether that's to rent a place to stay for the week and stay together, or hotel or whatever, to try to disrupt the child as little as possible.
Absolutely. And we're in this Zoom world, there's more opportunities with Zooming and FaceTime than ever before. God only knows.
Mhm.
Um, well, Harry, thank you so much. What I want to do is share our screen now. We have some, for people that want more information, need a little bit more tips and ideas. We have this resource list here, and anybody who's registered today will email this to you. But some just opportunities, some books and some articles that might give you a little bit more information on this topic. Such an important topic, and we all love our kids and want them to thrive and do well, and there are some good things to be learned. Harry, thank you so much for being here. You're the best.
Thank you for having me, and I wish everyone well. Thanks for participating in the panel, in the conference today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, so much. And if anyone who wants to share this, it'll be on our Kids in Crisis website, and you can see the other webinars we've done. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everybody.